The Tiger tank rose to fame not through the cold precision of history, but through the fire of myth. Decades of films and video games crowned it as an untouchable steel monster capable of crushing entire battalions with a single push. People spoke of it with reverence, as if logic and engineering no longer applied to such a machine. Its legend grew larger than its armor, larger than its real impact on the battlefield. This is the version of Tiger most people think they know. But the reality was far less romantic. The Tiger was powerful, yes, but also heavy, slow, unreliable, and frequently defeated not by enemy fire, but by mud, terrain, and mechanical failures. Most stories we remember were born not from the battlefield, but from the imagination of those who needed a monster to complete their tale. The myth survived longer than the machine itself. And that is where the misunderstanding begins. This video exists because 5 major myths about World War II continued to mislead millions. These myths shape how we see soldiers, how we judge strategy, and how we imagine the machines that defined an era. They turn history into spectacle and spectacle into mistaken memory. So today, we peel these myths back to their bones. No fantasy, no nostalgia, only the truth behind the steel. And it starts with the myth that built the Tiger's reputation in the first place. The myth people repeat without ever questioning it. The myth that shaped the battlefield far more than Tiger itself ever did. Myth number 1. The belief that the Tiger tank was invincible.
The first great myth does not begin with a battlefield statistic or a technical chart. It begins with an emotion: awe. For decades, the Tiger has lived in the public imagination as a creature of pure dominance, the tank that rewrote the rules of ground warfare and reduced every Allied crew to fear. But myths grow easily when fear becomes nostalgia, and nostalgia becomes legend. To understand why the myth persists, we need to rewind not to 1944, but to the cultural memory built after the war. Films, novels, video games, and documentaries crafted an image of the Tiger as a predator moving through the battlefield with absolute certainty. It is shown as the beast that cannot be flanked, cannot be penetrated, and cannot be escaped. The problem is not that the Tiger was weak. The problem is that the popular version of the Tiger is a character, not a machine. It performs for the camera, not for the battlefield. When we look at the real tank, the myth begins to crack. The Tiger's armor was strong, yes, but not invulnerable. The Tiger's gun was lethal, yes, but not unmatched. Its battlefield presence was powerful, but also deeply fragile because the Tiger was a machine that demanded perfect conditions in a war that provided almost none. It was too heavy for most bridges, too mechanically delicate for sustained operations, and too fuel-hungry for an army collapsing under logistical failure. Battlefield reports from 1943 to 1945 show a pattern that movies rarely mention. Most Tigers did not die in duels. They died in retreats, breakdowns, fuel shortages, artillery barrages, airstrikes, and abandoned withdrawals. The myth imagines Allied tank crews trembling at the sight of a Tiger. The record shows something different. They were taught not to fight it head-on, but to force it to move, to maneuver, or to expose itself. The Tiger could dominate a perfect engagement. It simply rarely received one. Technical data paints an even clearer picture. A Tiger required 10 hours of maintenance for every hour it operated. Its transmission was notoriously fragile, its engine strained under the tank's immense weight, and its tracks frequently broke under rough terrain. These details rarely fit into legendary narratives because they remind us that the Tiger was an engineering compromise, not a miracle. What looked invincible from the front was often vulnerable from every other angle. Even German crews left testimonies that contradict the myth. Many admired the Tiger's firepower, but feared its reliability. Some described the anxiety of entering battle, knowing the tank could stop dead from mechanical failure long before taking a single hit. Others noted that the Tiger's weight made it impossible to reposition quickly, turning it into a static target once the enemy understood its limitations. These are not the words of men piloting a god. They're the words of men handling a burden disguised as a weapon. So what remains when the myth is stripped away? The Tiger was powerful, yes. It inspired fear, yes. But power does not equal invincibility, and fear does not equal truth. The Tiger excelled in specific conditions, failed in many others, and influenced the war far less than the legend suggests. Understanding this is not about diminishing the machine. It is about restoring perspective. The Tiger was not a god of war. It was a weapon built by humans, limited by humans, and defeated by circumstances more often than by enemy shells. And this is why we begin the video with myth number 1. Because if the Tiger itself can be misremembered as invincible, then everything around World War II can be distorted just as easily. To challenge the Tiger myth is to challenge the way we accept history. And only by doing that can we understand the war as it truly was, not as legend prefers it to be. The second myth emerges from a simple, cinematic idea, that every Allied crew who saw a Tiger felt immediate terror, as if they had encountered a force beyond reason. This belief has survived for decades because it fits a dramatic story. A lone Tiger appears, Allied tanks panic, the battlefield becomes a stage where one machine dictates all movement. But reality rarely obeys such clean narratives. In truth, most Allied tank crews did not expect to duel the Tiger, nor did they shape their entire tactics around it. The Tiger was rare, mechanically unreliable, and frequently absent from key engagements. In many units, new soldiers never even saw one before the war ended. What the myth overlooks is the daily grind of armored warfare: mud, mines, ambushes, artillery, and enemy infantry with handheld weapons. These were far more common threats than any Tiger sighting. Allied records show a more nuanced emotional landscape. Crews respected the Tiger's capabilities, but fear was not their primary response. Instead, they adapted. They learned to call artillery rather than duel. They learned to flank rather than charge. They learned to immobilize rather than destroy. Training manuals emphasized that the Tiger was dangerous only when allowed to dictate distance and angle. If forced to move or reposition, its weaknesses multiplied. Field reports from Sherman, Cromwell, and T-34 crews describe Tiger encounters not as hopeless nightmares, but as tactical puzzles. Many crews wrote that the real danger was misidentification, since nearly every German tank was rumored to be a Tiger. Some Sherman units joked that they faced more Tigers in stories than on actual battlefields. The mythology inflated sightings, and inflated sightings created fear. But fear created by rumor is not the same as fear created by experience. And then there is the matter of numbers. At its peak, fewer than 1,400 Tigers of all variants were ever produced. By contrast, the Allies deployed tens of thousands of Shermans, T-34s, Churchills, and other armored vehicles. The idea that these armies lived in constant fear of a machine so rare is historically unsound. The Tiger was a threat, but not the threat. It was a weapon that appeared occasionally, influenced some battles, and was irrelevant in many others. More importantly, the Allies learned to exploit structural advantages that no Tiger could overcome. Air power, logistics, recovery vehicles, mass production, and coordinated combined arms doctrine created an ecosystem where even a superior tank could not shape the war alone. A Tiger on the field was impressive, A tiger without fuel, without infantry support, or without air cover was simply a metal box waiting for its turn to break. And this leads us to the core truth behind the second myth. The Allies did not fear the tiger. They respected it, studied it, and adapted to defeat it. The myth survives because fear is a simple story, and adaptation is a complicated one. But complicated stories are often closer to the truth. The tiger inspired anxiety, yes, but it rarely dictated outcomes. The war was decided not by singular machines, but by systems, logistics, and the cumulative force of millions acting in coordination.
The third myth is shaped by a dramatic image, a lone pilot diving straight into an Allied ship, turning himself into a living missile. Movies often portray these attacks as unstoppable, terrifying, and tactically brilliant. The narrative suggests that kamikaze missions force the Allies into constant fear. But when we examine the historical record, the image begins to fracture. The numbers tell a very different story from the legend. Kamikaze attacks were born not from strength, but from desperation. By late 1944, the Japanese Navy had lost most of its experienced pilots, its aircraft carriers, and its ability to challenge Allied air power. The tactic emerged because conventional aviation could no longer influence the war. Japan resorted to a strategy that sacrificed pilots in hopes of inflicting disproportionate damage. But intention and reality were not aligned. The results were far less decisive than often imagined. Reports show that tens of thousands of Japanese pilots trained for the mission, but only a fraction reached their targets. Allied radar, improved anti-aircraft guns, and overwhelming fighter superiority intercepted a majority of kamikaze attempts before they even approached the fleet. The iconic image of a pilot crashing into a carrier hides the statistical truth. Most kamikaze aircraft never struck anything at all. Their missions often ended in mechanical failure, misidentification, or destruction long before impact. Even when a kamikaze struck its target, the damage was often limited. Allied ships were designed with compartmentalization, firefighting systems, and rapid repair protocols that minimized long-term impact. Many damaged vessels returned to operation within hours. The tactic caused emotional shock, yes, but emotional shock is not the same as strategic success. A strategy that relies on pilots dying by the thousands cannot be considered efficient, especially when its measurable outcomes were inconsistent and short-lived. The myth persists because it creates a dramatic contrast: disciplined pilots versus powerful warships, sacrifice versus industrial might. It fits a narrative template audiences easily recognize: the lone individual defying a giant. But this framing simplifies a complex wartime tragedy. Many kamikaze pilots were barely trained, some coerced, and others misled into believing they were performing a noble, war-altering act. The truth is more painful and far less romantic. And then there is the strategic outcome. Despite all the lives lost, kamikaze missions did not slow the Allied advance. They did not prevent landings. They did not halt the naval blockade. They did not change resource shortages or industrial disparities. In the end, Japan surrendered not because kamikaze succeeded or failed, but because the broader structure of the war made victory impossible. A tactic cannot compensate for systemic collapse. And this leads to the core truth. Kamikaze was not an efficient weapon, nor an effective strategy. It was a tragic response to an unwinnable situation. Its legacy is not tactical brilliance, but the human cost of a nation pushed beyond its limits. Understanding this myth reminds us that warfare is not defined by dramatic scenes, but by logistics, production, and the irreversible consequences of desperation.
Myth 4 rises like a carved idol from the ruins of the Western Front, the belief that German soldiers possessed a level of training and discipline unmatched by any other army of the modern world. It is the myth fed endlessly by Hollywood films, World War II shooters, and documentaries built on outdated sources. It's a myth Americans argue about more fiercely than almost any other, because it offers a clean cinematic explanation. Germany lost, but only because the world combined against its super soldiers. Yet the deeper one travels into primary records, the faster the illusion fractures, and what remains is far more human, far more desperate, and far less mythic than the legend suggests. In the early war years, Germany's strength was not born from superhuman mastery, but from a coherent doctrine forged in the aftermath of World War I. The Wehrmacht excelled at rapid decision-making, decentralized command, and a style of maneuver warfare that other nations had neither predicted nor prepared for. These advantages created an aura of invincibility, a shadow that stretched across Europe as Poland, France, and the Low Countries fell with shocking speed. Yet this speed was strategic, not supernatural. It was the product of planning, not genetic destiny or mystical German efficiency. By 1943, the myth collapses completely. Germany was no longer fielding elite formations, but the remnants of an army exhausted by years of attrition. Teenagers with 6 weeks of training were marched to the front. Middle-aged factory workers were given rifles older than the men who carried them. Folkstorm units, desperate, underarmed, and barely prepared, were expected to hold back seasoned Soviet armies. Yet the myth survives because it offers emotional clarity. It rewrites chaos into structure, suffering into superiority, defeat into tragic heroism. Myth 4 persists not because it is true, but because it is comforting, a way to sanitize the brutal reality of a totalitarian war machine that ultimately collapsed under its own contradictions. And in the digital age, where nostalgia circulates faster than scholarship, this myth has become stronger than ever. But the fifth myth is heavier, almost radioactive in the way it distorts historical memory, the belief that Japan surrendered solely because of the atomic bombs. It is the myth repeated in classrooms, documentaries, and national narratives because it offers a clean ending to an impossibly complex war. One bright flash, one mushroom cloud, one decision made inevitable. But history refuses to obey such simplicity. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria shattered Japan's last strategic hope. Within days, the Kwantung Army, once considered elite, collapsed under overwhelming pressure. Political factions in Tokyo spiraled into crisis as the civilian government, military leadership, and imperial loyalists fell into bitter conflict. Meanwhile, the economy had already imploded. Infrastructure was burned to ash, and famine loomed over the home islands. The empire was collapsing from every direction long before the bombs fell. So why does the myth endure? Because a mushroom cloud is easier to visualize than the slow disintegration of an empire. Because the bomb provides moral clarity, while Soviet tanks, political collapse, and economic starvation do not. Because humans prefer a single decisive moment over months of despair, fear, and inevitability. Myth 5 survives because it is simple, and simplicity is powerful. And together, these two myths shape the way millions view the Second World War. One myth exalts German soldiers into figures of tragic brilliance. The other compresses the Pacific War into a single blinding moment. Both distort, both simplify, and both survive because they offer emotional comfort rather than historical truth. And as long as they survive, the war does too, not in trenches or ruins, but in memory itself.
History does not echo through time because of the machines we build, but because of the illusions we choose to keep. And the tiger, the myth of the perfect German soldier, and the belief that the atomic bomb alone bent an empire to its knees, all stand as reminders of how eager we are to simplify what should never be simple. In the fading light of the past, these myths glow like embers, warm, familiar, and dangerously misleading. But when the smoke clears, the truth remains sharper than steel. Lesson 1 emerges clearly. No weapon, no army, no nation possesses invincibility. What seems unstoppable is often just misunderstood, and what seems legendary often hides a trail of failures behind it. Lesson 2 follows.
Myths are not born from truth alone. They are fed by pride, fear, propaganda, and the need for heroes. And Lesson 3 cuts the deepest of all. If we do not challenge the stories we inherit, we risk repeating the mistakes they once tried to glorify. So if this journey meant anything, let it be this. Keep questioning the legends. Keep turning the stones. Keep dragging the past back into the harsh light where it cannot hide. The world does not need more myths. It needs clarity. And if you want more truths uncovered, more legends dismantled, then stay with this channel. Like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which myth we should break next. Because every myth falls the same way, with a single fracture in the story.